I guess I belong to what the white man calls the baby boom, being born in 1946. And as a young man growing up in our family, we had certain places in our house that were places of honor. And as a young man, I grew up seeing a photograph of my grandmother's brother. His name was Matthew Hall Ziptine. He was killed in action in World War II. I also had an uncle, George Asapermy Sr., who served during the Korean War era, although he didn't actually go to Korea. I had an aunt who served in the United States Air Force in 1954 and 1955. So as I grew up, I saw these pictures, and they were kind of encouragement for me to join the military. And after graduation from high school in 1965, I attended a junior college near Apache for a semester and a half, and one day just got the urge and joined the United States Army. Because I was legally blind in my right eye, I memorized the eye test, got away with it, and was inducted or enlisted into the United States Army. I served from 1966 to 1990. I retired as a Sergeant Major. Served overseas tours in Hawaii, Korea twice, Germany, and one tour of duty in Vietnam. As I grew up, it was always games that we played. We played, of course, cowboys and Indians. We also played soldier. And when I played soldier as a young man, the enemy was the Japs, and I don't know why, or the Germans. I guess memories of the Second World War was still with us. As I grew up, I didn't want to be anything but a soldier. That was my goal. I went to college because my grandfather wanted me to go to college. When I turned 19, I decided, without telling anyone, that I was going to fulfill my dream and become a soldier. With the thought that as a soldier, I would also become a warrior. When I enlisted in the military, I enlisted with two guarantees. One, that I would be in combat arms as a tanker or armor crewman, and two, that I would serve a tour in Korea. Both these guarantees were met. I was trained as a armor crewman, and I was sent to Korea. I spent 19 months there, returned to the United States, became a drill sergeant, and volunteered to go to Vietnam. I was sent to Vietnam mid-August 1969, and I served until mid-August of 1970. I was assigned to the 1st Battalion, 77th Armor, first as a tank commander for 2.5 months, and then as a scout section sergeant for the remainder of that time. I was with the 1st Brigade, 5th Infantry Division. We only had one brigade there. Our main base camp was Swan Tree Fire Base, although I did spend some time at LZ Nancy, LZ Sharon, and some of the other exotic places in Vietnam, to include places like Hoa Viet, Cam Lo, the Rock Pile, Vandergrift, Khe Sanh, places that only other people have gone that would recognize. I went because I thought I was a good soldier. I went to fulfill my commitment as a warrior. While there, my unit engaged the enemy on 12 occasions. We didn't call them battles, we called them firefights. The shortest probably lasted 10 minutes, the longest 2 hours. It wasn't necessarily an exchange of rifle fire. It could have been an exchange of rifle fire, mortar fire, rocket fire, grenades, things of this nature. My unit suffered one casualty while I was there, and we counted 22 enemy dead. The first occasion was an ambush that I was responsible for. We killed 5 of the enemy, including 1 woman who was the rear security. We didn't have time to bury these people. We piled them up, wrapped C4, det cord, and disposed of them in that manner. The second major battle or firefight that I was involved in which we suffered, or the enemy suffered losses, was approximately a month and a half prior to my departure from Vietnam, when 22 brave North Vietnamese soldiers attacked our position, despite being outnumbered about 100 to 22. Presented a frontal attack to us about 2 a.m. in the morning. We killed 17 of the enemy. We captured 1. 4 got away. We tracked them for 3 days. Were unable to find them. Our losses was 1 man wounded. The other firefights that I was involved in, there was only a loss of life once. A track, a vehicle that one of my soldiers was on, hit a mine. He was killed. We never saw the enemy. We never engaged the enemy. And it was unfortunate that this young man had to give his life in that manner. The Vietnam War was a war that may not have been right, but as a soldier or a Marine, an airman, a sailor, when you're told to perform your patriotic duty, when you're told that you are to do this, and that, as a good soldier, you salute and you go do your duty whether you agree or you disagree. I'm not saying that the war was right. It was a political war. We were never allowed to use our full strength to engage the enemy. We had certain times of the day we couldn't shoot at the enemy. We had certain areas that we couldn't shoot at the enemy. We weren't turned loose. It wasn't a full effort on our part. But that wasn't the soldier's fault, the soldier that was fighting. It was something that we were told we couldn't do, and in some cases there were things that we could do. I was very proud to serve in Vietnam. I think I fulfilled my commitment as a warrior in the old Comanche Kiowa tradition, because I faced the enemy, I fought the enemy, killed the enemy, and I was able to walk away from it, thankfully. After Vietnam, I returned home. I returned home to a hostile America. Things were said to me that weren't very pleasant. I was never welcomed except by my Indian people. When I did return home to my Indian people, they treated me like a hero. They treated me much like the warriors of old. After a battle, a successful battle, the warriors would stop outside the camp. They would dress in their finest, and they would sort of parade into the camp. The women would lulu, the children would scream and holler, and it was more or less a parade because it was a successful battle. My successful battle was completed. I fought with honor, I feel. I had engaged the enemy, and I had defeated the enemy. When I returned, my Indian people were proud of my accomplishments, unlike the white. So I felt good about what I did. I continued to serve in the military. I trained soldiers to go back to Vietnam. I trained soldiers to fight in future wars. I did this until 1990, when I retired from the military. I'm very proud that I was able to achieve the rank of Sergeant Major. I was very proud of the 47 awards and decorations that I had received during my 24 years in the military. I feel like that I did my duty not only as an American, but as an American Indian. I served as a soldier to the Americans, and I served as a warrior to my Indian people. Adjusting to civilian life has been very difficult. I like to do research on our previous warriors that have served during the 20th century. All these men that I mentioned earlier, these 18 men who gave their lives, one's buried in Holland, one's buried in France. 2 of them's bodies have never recovered. But the other 14, I made it a pilgrimage, a special thing for me to go to the gravesite or to find out where the gravesite of each one of these men. And I did go visit all these gravesites, and I did thank them for what they did for our country. I thanked them for serving our country honorably. I thanked them for the way that they upheld the old traditions of the Comanche and the Kiowa and the Apache. I thanked them for the supreme sacrifice that they gave to their country, and that was their life. It was only fitting that that this be done. And I did it in my way. I could have very well been amongst them, but fortunately, the training I received in the military, the warrior blood that ran in our family, probably helped me survive times while in combat and times while not in combat in the military. I never learned a language because my grandfather was Comanche and my grandmother was Kiowa, and they really didn't communicate in their own language to each other because they didn't fully understand that language. When a Comanche would visit, my grandfather would visit and talk in Comanche. And my grandmother, when a Kiowa would visit, would speak in her native tongue. So I don't know the language. I know words here and there about the 2 different tribal languages, but I cannot speak them freely. My Comanche name was given to me by my grandfather, I guess when I was in the 1st grade, when the teacher asked him, "What is this boy's name?" He said his name is Asapermy. Asapermy is actually said in Comanche Asapermy, and the long interpretation of this name is to see through gray eyes. Now, I was given a Kiowa name by a Kiowa elder, a relative of my grandmother. His name was George Tawbone. I can't pronounce the name properly in Kiowa, but the meaning was never got shot. This was my great-great-great-grandfather's name on the Kiowa side. The Comanches and the Kiowas and the Kiowa Apaches, now known as the Apache Tribe of Oklahoma, formed an allegiance in about 1790. At one time, the Kiowas and the Comanches fought against each other. The Comanches probably outnumbered the Kiowas 2-1, but the Kiowas were such good fighters that they held their own in most battles against each other. So it came to be that the Comanches decided that, and the Kiowas too, decided that they should join forces since they were such good fighters or warriors. And of course the Kiowa Apaches, they were kind of like followers of the Kiowas, became an ally too. To this day, that allegiance still exists. And it's called the KCA, the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache. And they're headquartered, I guess, at Fort Sill, the old Fort Sill Indian School in Lawton, Oklahoma. In the early days of this allegiance, and prior to this allegiance, the Kiowas, the Comanches, and the Apaches, most of their warring was against other tribes. The Comanches went all three tribes basically went as far south into Mexico to steal horses, take captives. They fought the Navajo. They fought the Mescalero Apaches. They fought the Utes to the north. They fought the Texas Rangers. Eventually, they fought the United States Cavalry. Their home base, after moving from the north, was basically south of the Wichita Mountains, the Kiowas, north of the Wichita Mountains, and the Kiowa Apaches, somewhere in the vicinity of the Kiowas. The universal language back then was Comanche, I guess because maybe it was a simple language to learn. If you had a Kiowa Apache, and a Comanche and a white man together, then they would converse generally in Comanche with a lot of sign language. The Comanches were known as the Lords of the Plains. They were probably the best horsemen along with the Kiowas. They bred their stock where they came up with a horse that was very durable for their purposes of war. A war journey with them could last up to 2 years. They would be away from home. They weren't organized into any kind of societies. It was a situation where a man would say, I'm going to go steal some horses tomorrow. I'm leaving at sunrise. Just generally make the announcement, and whoever wanted to go would join the party. Or a man might say, I'm going to the north to fight the Utes. I'm leaving at sunrise tomorrow, and whoever wanted to join the war party would accompany them. That man was generally in charge. He probably generally appointed a second in command. Women went, children went. In some cases, the women did the cooking. They tended to wounded when needed. The young boys that went tended to horses. And there was a name for these young boys that were too young, generally 14, 13 years old, that I can't pronounce in Comanche, but nowadays I guess we call them runners. The Penatuka band of the Comanches, in every major engagement they had with the U.S. Cavalry, never lost a battle. The Penatukas, which I'm a member of that band, was basically undefeated, and it was also the largest band of Comanches. The Kiowa band that my grandmother belonged to was a band that they called, I believe, Under the Bank, or a cut in the bank. Now, the Kiowas, they did have their particular warrior societies. The most elite was called the 10 Most Bravest. They had a group they called the Black Leggings, or the Tonkonga, and they too were probably a little bit more organized as the Comanches in battle. First contact that the Comanches and the Kiowas made with the U.S. military was in 1834 between the town of Lawton and Apache, Oklahoma. This was called the Dragoons. It was a friendly encounter. There was no war. The first physical fighting that they did with the U.S. government or the U.S. military was probably in the 1850s, although the Comanches did war with the Texas Rangers prior to that and also during that time. As treaties were signed in the 1860s, land was being taken away. War became more relevant with the Comanches and the Kiowas and the Apaches. The last battle that the Comanches fought was in Palo Duro Canyon, which the U.S. Cavalry found them in the panhandle of Texas. And they didn't lose very many men, but they had over 2,000 horses destroyed. At that time, the last holdouts of the Comanches returned to Fort Sill, put on a reservation, and then start walking the white man's road. my grandfather's father, his English name was John Whiteman, probably took part in the 1874 battle at Adobe Walls, in which Kiowas, Cheyennes, Apaches, and Comanches fought a group of buffalo hunters. He was a young man of 15 at the time. He was probably one of the runners, probably held the horses. And that's kind of how our history, as far as I know, traces back to being warriors, or what we call modern-day soldiers to this day. After the Kiowas, Comanches, and Apaches went on reservations, we lost a lot of our prestige, our self-esteem. We became humiliated in a sense because we were no longer warriors. As a young man, a Comanche or a Kiowa or Apache, as they grew up to be warriors. That was their sole purpose in life, whereas nowadays a young man would grow up to get educated and to make a life for himself. Well, back then, he grew up to be able to run, to possess stamina, to learn how to ride a horse, how to use different weapons such as the bow, the arrow, the lance, the hatchet. He learned how to hunt to provide for his family, and he learned how to fight the enemy. And although the Comanches and the Kiowas both were in numerous bands, it was unfortunate. I say unfortunate because they never did gather as Comanches and join forces to fight the United States military. So once we went on reservations, that prestige of being a warrior was gone. We no longer had that. We were told that we would be farmers, that we would live like the white man. So the generation from about 1875 to about 1892 was a generation where probably most Comanche men felt worthless. They grew up trying to learn the ways of the white man, trying to learn the ways of being farmers. They were given handouts, blankets. They were given food, things like this. They weren't allowed to have certain weapons. If they were allowed to have weapons, they were limited on ammunition. They didn't have the resources to make some of the weapons that they had, and they survived in a prior time. After we were moved to the reservations in about 1874, 1875, the military at Fort Sill established a small detachment of Indian Scouts. They issued them uniforms, and their job basically was to carry messages to Fort Sill and other outposts around Fort Sill. They also helped guard the paymaster, and they searched for outlaws and deserters. So some of that prestige they had as warriors was returned to them by means of a uniform and a weapon and a duty, or a sense of duty. The Indian Scouts were disbanded after a year, and we went back into the mode where we fell into disgrace again. We really didn't have a sense or a purpose of life. We were told to be farmers, to live at certain areas, eat the white man's food and things of this nature. In September of 1892, this generation had gone another 17 years. So most of the young men that were prime warriors at age 15, 16, 17, up to 20, they were now in their 30s. The U.S. Cavalry, under the command of Lieutenant Hugh Scott, established Troop L, 7th Cavalry. And they started these different troops throughout the United States. The Sioux, the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Navajo, the Apache, they all had different troops of the 7th Cavalry, and their purpose were to serve as Indian Scouts. Well, this sort of reestablished the Comanches and the Kiowas and the Apaches. It gave them some of that prestige that they would have had it been the old days and they were warriors. They liked the uniforms. They liked having a weapon again. They were a little bit more organized than before. They were given leadership roles and things of this nature, but they were given that sense of pride back. And one of the most famous scouts in Troop L was a man by the name of Geronimo. He wanted to be the boss. He was just a private, so he quit them. Now, the scouts were mostly made up of Kiowas. There were 16 Comanches that were Indian scouts. They weren't thought very well of by a lot of the older warriors or the men that used to be warriors because they were part of the enemy at one time. These scouts were said to be good soldiers. They said they were good marksmen. They said their discipline was exceptional and that they were exceptionally proud of their uniforms. About 1896, they disbanded the Scouts again. Although it was a success, they disbanded them, and here we go back to how it was when we went on reservations. A sense of loss of self-esteem, no sense of purpose in life, become farmers again, subsidize off the government with their handouts and things of this nature. So the generation immediately after going on to reservations, they never knew what it was to be a warrior. They had to follow the white man's law and live on the reservation. The Spanish-American War, I have not heard any verbal history or seen anything in black and white where any Comanche, Kiowa, or Apache served during this war. I know other Indians did serve in this war, but to my knowledge, no Kiowa, Comanche, or Apache served in this war. World War I developed in 1917. There were some Kiowas that served during the First World War. There were some Comanches that served, and I'm not sure if there was any Apaches. Some actually went overseas and fought. The thing that you stop and think about this was that these men either volunteered or they were drafted. A lot of the men that were drafted, they protested going into the military during that time because they were not citizens of the United States. And we were not made citizens until 1923, although we fought in the uniformed forces of the United States. We fought in a war that was across the water in Europe. I don't know how we fought because there are no survivors. I'm sure we held our own. It was kind of a good, bad, or no-win situation because some of the Indians felt that it wasn't right for us to serve in the military, while others wanted to gain that prestige back that they had lost in the mid-1870s. When we became citizens in 1923, of course, that made us eligible for the draft, which really was kind of at a low point until the late 1930s when the war clouds of World War II developed. The majority of the Indians that served in World War II volunteered, although I'm sure that some of them were draftees. And it was a great honor. Times had changed so much from 1917 to 1939, 1938, 1940 to fight for this American flag, for this country. It was a time of 65 years from the reservations until the Second World War, 2 generations possibly. The blood that was in our veins probably had a lot to do with it. It gave the Comanche and the Kiowa and the Apache a, 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 a chance to become a warrior again. and most readily accepted the challenge, joined to fight in the Great World War II. The military realized that there was an opportunity for Native Americans, or I don't like the term Native Americans. When I grew up, I was an Indian. I'm still an Indian. When I went to the military, I was an American Indian. And then properly now, I guess I'm a Native American. But the military realized that they could use the native tongue of some of the Indians, and they established units from the Navajo Nation, the Comanche tribe, and also, I believe, the Choctaw tribe, where they would use their language so the Germans and the Japanese would not be able to break the code, and they were able to send messages in this manner. The Comanches, they asked for volunteers, and if I'm not mistaken, there was 21 Comanches that were selected to be code talkers. Well, somewhere along the line, that group ended up being 14. There's one survivor left to this day. His name is Charles Chibitty from Tulsa, Oklahoma. They were part of the Normandy invasion. They were able to use their code. They were basically infantrymen, grunts. They landed on the beaches of Normandy, fought their way into Germany. Their use as code talkers was very limited, but it was used not to the extent of the Navajos in the Pacific, but it was used to an extent where it may have helped turn the tide of battle on occasion here and there. And like I say, most of these code talkers were their main job in the military was as infantry. During this century, in the last 99 years, we have lost 8 Kiowas, 8 Comanches, 1 Kiowa Comanche, and 1 Apache due to the tragedies of war. In a 24-year span from 1924 until 1968, 24 of our men have made the supreme sacrifice. They have been killed in action while engaged with the enemy. During the Second World War, there were 4 Kiowas that were killed in action. The first Kiowa killed was a corporal by the name of Lindrell Leon Palmer. He was part of the 3rd Army, and he was killed in action on December the 5th, 1944. He had 7 brothers that served. I believe 5 of them, counting himself, served in combat. He is buried in France because his father, who was a Choctaw, he was a Kiowa Choctaw, said he should be put where he fell, which is unlike Kiowa tradition. Back in the old days, if a Kiowa fell, or a Comanche, it was always our way to go get and recover. But he's buried in France.
Was that during the Battle of the Bulge?
No, it was prior. It was on December 5th, 1944. It was not actually during the Battle of the Bulge. It was. You've got to remember that once Normandy happened in June of 1944, that it was kind of like a ongoing battle. I mean, there was large battles, small battles, and it was just a continuous fight into Germany. What could have happened? He was killed on a recon patrol, according to his brother, and he was the first Kiowa killed. My grandmother's brother name was Matthew Asapermy, and I mentioned him earlier during this tape. His picture had always hung in a place of honor in our home. He was killed on April the 10th, 1945, 28 days before the Second World War ended in Europe. He had landed initially in North Africa, was wounded in North Africa, could have come home but opted to stay with the unit. So he fought in North Africa, he fought in Sicily, Malta, up the Italian boot, and then he was sent in as a replacement with a particular unit, the 84th Infantry Division. And they had fought their way past the Siegfried Line to the Ardennes. He participated in the Battle of the Bulge. and he was killed in a little town called Weeden, Germany, prior to the Battle of Hanover. And research said that he was killed by 2 German officers after his company had captured a canal bridge. They were holding 12 Germans captured. These 2 German officers happened on the scene by accident, opened up, killed him and a medic, and then were cut down by the rest of the company. It took 4 years and 10 days for his body to be returned, and he was buried in Anadarko, Oklahoma. PFC Joe Gulado was killed during the battle, or the Luzon in the Philippine campaign, at a place called Mount Malpunan. And I remember seeing a picture of him and 4 of his comrades holding a Japanese flag. And he was killed on April the 12th, 2 days after Matthew in 1945. And the last Kiowa killed during the Second World War was a man by the name of Private George Narconi. I'm unable to tell you anything else about him other than he served with the 165th Infantry Regiment. Comanches that were killed in action. The first Comanche killed was a man by the name of Sergeant Melvin Hawkeye Myers. He was part of the D-Day invasion. He was with the 82nd Airborne Division. He trained in England and the United States, and then in England. He was dropped behind enemy lines on June the 6th, early June the 6th, 1944. He lasted 2 days, and he was killed in France near the town of St. Lo, which was probably one of the biggest battles of the Second World War. A private by the name of Eli Hosatosevich. He was with a 634 Tank Destroyer Battalion, was killed on August 1st. On August the 7th, PFC Thomas Chuck Poya Jr. was killed in action. Both these men had probably come in on D-Day, and they were making the push off Normandy, which was probably the most fierce fighting ever in military history. They were killed 6 days apart. And they fought against probably the greatest army ever assembled. And this was the German army. And the last man, or 2 other men, were killed in action. One was Private Henry Dutch Kosachata. He was an engineer. He was shot by a German sniper on May the 1st, 1945. And then PFC Henry William Conwu was killed in the Pacific, also on the Luzon in the Philippines. He was killed 2 days after PFC Joe Gulado was killed during the same campaign. Dutch Kosachata was killed 14 days before the war ended. 14 days. And it's unfortunate. So we lost 5 Comanches and 4 Kiowas during this frame, during the Second World War. But when these men came home, they came home as heroes. They were warriors again. They had regained some of that prestige that we had lost in the 1870s when our identity as warriors was taken away from us. They regained some of that for us and kind of put it back into perspective of what we was and what we could be. We lost 5 Comanches and 4 Kiowas during the Second World War. But it gave us a sense of honor that we were once again warriors and we were contributing to something. And in this particular case, as citizens of the United States, we were contributing to the freedom of the United States, and we fought for that glorious flag. The Korean War started in 1950, and initially it was called a police action, although later the military classified it as a war. Again, our Comanches and our Kiowa and our Apache men answered the call, either through the draft and in most cases by volunteering. And unfortunately, again, the loss of life, the supreme sacrifice occurred amongst the Kiowas and the Comanches and the Apaches in this case. The Comanches only lost 1 man. He was a lieutenant colonel by the name of Meech Tashikwa. He was shot down on a supply mission over the Korean Peninsula. He, plane, and none of his crew was ever recovered. He had also fought in World War II. He had flown over 300 combat hours, bombing missions, 31 bombing missions during the Second World War. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross twice, the Purple Heart twice. And it was unfortunate that he was shot down during the Korean War, and it was even more unfortunate that his body and the bodies of his comrades were never recovered. The Kiowas lost two men. One was by the name of Silas Boydell. He was a infantryman. His unit was overrun in 1950. It was at first thought he was captured. His parents received a letter from the Department of the Army saying that there was a possibility he was captured. And then 4 years later, in February the 18th, 1954, his parents received a letter that he was considered missing in action, and they also declared him dead. His body was never recovered. Sergeant Luke Buddy Tampey was killed in action on March 28, 1951 in Korea. Sergeant Tampey had also fought in World War II, but he answered the call again, went to Korea, and unfortunately he was killed in action. The Apaches lost their only tribal member during the Korean War. His name was Corporal Austin Lewis Kleinkohl. He was a member of the 2nd Infantry Division. He was killed in action on September the 18th, 1951. We also had a Kiowa Comanche that was captured during the war by the name of Dennis King Carty. He was captured by the North Koreans. He was wounded several times resisting captive. A fellow prisoner of war with him had come home and told his parents that he had seen Dennis King Carty and that he had been wounded several times. And all of the official list of death by the North Koreans was pneumonia. This fellow prisoner of war said he died of those wounds while in Korea. His body was sent back to the United States, and he was buried in Lawton, Oklahoma in 1954. We lost 4 men during the Vietnam War. The Kiowas lost the most decorated American Indian in U.S. military history. His name was Pascal Cletus Poulov. This man had served in the United States Army for over 25 years. He had fought in World War II, the Korean War, and in Vietnam. And the reason he was in Vietnam was to keep his sons from going there. It didn't work because his sons did go over there. They did fight. Pascal didn't make it, though. He received over 42 awards and decorations, including 22 for combat service and 12 for acts of valor. He was put in for the Medal of Honor. It was downgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross. He was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and he had been wounded in combat 3 or 4 times. He is also a native of my hometown, Apache, Oklahoma. The other man that the Kiowas lost was a sergeant, a staff sergeant by the name of Donald Bear. Donald Bear had completed 1 tour of duty in Vietnam, volunteered to go back for a second tour of duty. He did, and unfortunately he was killed in action. He was awarded the Silver Star and the Purple Heart for valor in combat. The Comanches lost 2 other men during the Vietnam War. The first to die was a private first class by the name of Russell Rusty Eugene Pisawanet. He grew up in Mescalero. He was half Comanche, half Mescalero Apache. He was in the United States Marine Corps, and he had only been in Vietnam for a total of 6 days when he was killed in a firefight with North Vietnamese regulars. The last Indian, or the last Comanche, or Kiowa, for that matter, to be killed in action was a corporal by the name of Robert Carlos Pacheco. He was a member of the United States Marine Corps. He was killed on October the 22nd, 1968. As I said earlier, there have been 8 Kiowas, 8 Comanches, 1 Kiowa Comanche, and 1 Apache killed during the 20th century while serving in the armed forces of the United States. It's unfortunate that, or maybe it's not unfortunate. It depends on how you look at it. Sometimes I feel like I was born 150 years too soon. But the Comanche and the Kiowa Apache or the Apache, they were great warriors. They were small in number, but they made it up with their tactics, their wizardry of weapons, with their discipline, with their braveness, first against other tribes, then against the Mexicans, then against the Texas Rangers, and then against the United States Cavalry. When it was time to stop fighting, they stopped as gracefully as possible. They adapted to the white man's way, although it was slow, painstaking, and they were able to become warriors again, thanks to the armed forces of the United States. I never heard of an Indian that has dodged a draft when the draft was present. I never heard of an Indian that went to Canada. And I think all Indians at one time or another, because the blood of our forefathers run through our veins still to this day, want to be or want to make a contribution to America. Not so much anymore as a military contribution, but as educators, as policemen, firefighters, executives in different fields. But nowadays, with the generation that is amongst us now, the warrior ways are almost gone. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But it's taken 125 years for this to happen. We do still have some young men that are willing to go, and that do go, and that do serve in the armed forces of the United States, because that blood still is heavy in our system. But I'm very proud of the way that the Comanches and the Kiowas and the Kiowa Apaches held themselves and their place in history. In the Army, on their flag, they keep a streamer of all the campaigns that the military or the Army has fought. There's over 190 of them. The second longest campaign that the United States Army engaged in was a campaign against the Comanche tribe. It's called the Comanche Campaign. It should have been called the Comanche Kiowa Campaign, but it was called the Comanche Campaign, and this campaign lasted 9 years. It's the second longest campaign in the United States Army history. That's how long it took to defeat, or not, and they really didn't defeat us, to put us on reservations. It took them 9 years to do this. Perhaps the greatest army in the world. It took us 9 years. That same army, it took them 100 hours to subdue a whole nation. So you can't tell me that the Comanches and the Kiowas and the Apaches and other tribes, the Sioux, the Crow, the Apache, that they weren't great warriors. The Seminole, the Osage, and we all had a role, and we still have a role to this day. Many of our Indian men still serve in the armed forces, and women still serve in the armed forces. To them, I am extremely proud, And I'm also extremely proud that I had the opportunity to serve our country. As I said earlier, not only as an American, but as an American Indian, and as not only as a soldier, but as a warrior of old.